Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this morning on what's changed in Cyber Essentials. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Barge. I'm the Managing Director at Risk Evolves, and I'm delighted to introduce once again friend of Risk Evolves and one of our key partners when delivering Cyber Essentials, Maritz Cloete from More Clearcom, formerly CSRisk Management. There's a bit of a mouthful. It's easier to say More Clearcom, Maritz. Maritz, do you want to just give a quick intro before we kick off?
Yeah, so hello there, my name is Maritz. We work quite closely with Helen's team. We're the certification body for many of Helen's Cyber Essentials customers. So we're a cybersecurity consultancy, but obviously one of the key services we deliver is Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus, which we've been doing probably for the last 5 or 6 years now, pretty much since the scheme started. So we've sort of been on this bumpy journey along with IASME and all the other fun that's been happening.
So thanks, Maritz. For those of you that aren't aware, this webinar is being recorded. We'll post it on the Risk Evolves website at the end of the session. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, we have a copy of the slides, which is in the handout pull-out, which you can obviously take away. And you have the ability as well to ask questions as we go through. And we will say, please ask questions. Maritz and I are really aware that there have been some pretty significant changes to the Cyber Essentials question set, which is now live. This is the only question set you can now certify to, unless you bought a package pre the 24th of January. So I think without further ado, Maritz, I'm going to hand over to you. We step through, and if you want to ask a question, please just type a question in the pop-out box and I'll stop Maritz as we're going through. So thanks.
Brilliant. Cool. So yeah, so some of the headlines, and we're going to dig into some of these details a little bit as part of this session. So as Helen's already mentioned, the new Evendeen edition of Cyber Essentials has gone live from the 24th of January. So if you're already currently underway or have sort of started the process and have got a portal account set up prior to that, you'll still be able to assess against the beacon version of the scheme. And also, if you're going to go through to Cyber Essentials Plus, if you've done a beacon version of Cyber Essentials, then your Cyber Essentials Plus will be on that version as well. But if you start anything after, well, yesterday, essentially you'll be on the new Evendeen edition, and therefore you need to probably listen quite closely to the changes that are coming through. So the biggest change is around the scope of Cyber Essentials. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But the biggest change is the inclusion of cloud services. So that I imagine is going to elicit a little bit of questions and response. So really keen to have a discussion with you guys on that one once we get to that sort of that slide. A lot of the other controls are evolution of Cyber Essentials, just to reflect how the IT's change, how we use IT have changed over the last few years, especially with COVID, more working from home, more difficult to manage IT when people work from home or work remotely, and it looks like obviously that sort of trait is there to stay in terms of people working remotely. So there's some more questions specifically around that and some more detail around that. Also, Cyber Essentials Plus has got a little bit of a rework. There's additional tests to sort of test some of the bits that are now part of the Cyber Essentials scope. There's changes in the pricing as well from the 24th of January for Cyber Essentials Basic. Those are all set prices that the NCSC and IASME has agreed. So the price, no matter which certification body you go to, you will be paying those prices for the basic, for the self-assessment. But also Cyber Essentials Plus prices will be going up a little bit as well because there's additional tests we need to carry out. So we'll go through all those bits in a second, or as part of the session ultimately. So just a quick review of the scoping principles. So typically, your Cyber Essentials scope covers the whole of your IT infrastructure used to perform or support the business. Or you can do a well-defined and separately managed subset. So most of you guys, most of Helen's clients tend to do the whole company, but you have got the option to do a subset, so essentially a walled garden environment, or have a walled garden around the bit that's not Cyber Essentials, but there's very specific rules around how that walled garden has to be constructed now. So a lot of these you might recognize. So it essentially applies to all devices and software that connects to your corporate services that can either accept an incoming network connection from untrusted networks, a web service, VPN. So anything that's sort of published to the internet that's publicly accessible. Any devices that can establish an outbound connection via the internet. So that would tend to be your end user devices. It could be servers. It could be mobile devices as well. Anything that controls the flow of data between those devices. So things like firewalls and routers are in scope. And an interesting point that IASME made is all applications must now include some end user devices in scope. Some cloud service providers only included their cloud environment, but they didn't include the devices that engineers use to connect to the cloud environment. But actually, that's where the risk comes from. So they just made it clear to make sure that you have to have some end user devices within your scope. You cannot just certify a server environment, for example. It's not something we've come across before, but obviously there's so many different clients that yeah, some of these oddities do appear. So they felt there was enough of a reason to make that quite clear. So this is the new scope diagram that you can find in the requirements document that the National Cybersecurity Center publishes, which is now version 3 of the Cyber Essentials technical requirements. There's a link right at the end of the slides to be able, if you're interested in digging into the detail. But we're just going to go through this quickly and just highlight where the biggest changes were on this. So might as well bite the big one off first. Cloud services is now in scope. I think I think through the course of last year, and actually when we did this seminar last time or the webinar last time, we did say that this was coming. So hopefully it's not a massive surprise. I think the bit that is the challenge is the extent to which it is in scope. So essentially what we have is it includes any infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service that you use as a business. So that would include, obviously it will include Office 365 and Google Mail, or if you use a different sort of platform under the platform as a service side of things. But it also includes infrastructure as a service. So AWS, Azure, anywhere where you host servers or services on those platforms. And then the biggest one, which is going to cause a lot of interesting conversations, is software as a service. So any software as a service that you use within the business.
And we've already spoken, yeah. Maritz, haven't we? This is going to cause huge challenges, yeah. And I know, Risk Evolves is Cyber Essentials certified and has been since 2015. This has generated all sorts of questions for me as a business. So yeah, we'll see whether we can work through some of those questions as we go through the slide deck. Yeah,
I think we were just working through in our heads how many software as a services we use. So we were thinking our accounting package is software as a service, HR is software as a service.
CRM.
Where do you CRM software as a service,
proposal management. Absolutely. Yeah, yep. It's probably more than we all give thought for. And I think one of my learning points as well was, as owners, we have to be cognizant of every software as a service that's being used, even if it's not being used by the main team. Perhaps it's something that's being used on an ad hoc basis by, I don't know, the marketing team. We need to get our arms around everything.
Yeah. So that does come back to good inventory management, and including clouds included in it as well. But essentially, all of the Cyber Essentials requirements apply to those platforms as well. So things around your admin access, not having admin users with both admin and normal user access. So for example, in Office 365, your administrators shouldn't have normal user accounts and then have global admin as well. They should have a separate account for global admin. But if you start sort of drawing that principle down to some of the other cloud services like accounting, that's when it starts getting really messy and complicated, because other platforms aren't necessarily designed for that mechanism to be there. We were talking about the accounting platforms, for example, where your accountants are normally administrators. All of the accountants are set up as administrators. That's their user account. So how are we gonna balance that? I think it's going to be a big challenge.
And as we go through this, Maritz, as well, I know that a couple of our clients are software as a service themselves providers. They actually develop software as a service for their clients. I think that I would say to those users, just think about how you're going to manage Cyber Essentials for yourself, but also how you're going to have to interlock as well with your clients who may themselves be wishing to Cyber Essentials certify, and therefore your SaaS provision comes under their scope.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're going to have to think about how do you enable your customers to be able to be compliant or using your SaaS solution at the end of the day as well. So I'm hoping it's going to drive change. The big issue is they require multi-factor authentication for use of cloud services. Where there's not multi-factor, then you'll be expected to have complex password arrangements in place as well as account lockout and all that sort of good stuff. There's a bit of a lead time. So what we're expecting to see is for this year is that MFA, multi-factor authentication or tokenized login is, or login using a token of sorts, is enabled for all admin users. So for example, on Office 365, that'll be all your global admins or your Dynamic 365 admins. On Gmail, it'll be your sort of Gmail administrator. But from January 2023, the expectation is that MFA will be enabled for all users where MFA is available. So conditional access is allowed. So for those of you who already got MFA enabled and you've got conditional access is fine. Connecting via a trusted device, connecting via a trusted network, using periodic revalidation in that sense, maybe every 14 or 30 days, ask for MFA. And then obviously if you connect from a new device, it will enforce MFA login. So that's the expectation of what we expect to see when we do our testing. Just wondering if there's any questions on this one before I move forward.
Not as yet, Maritz, but I'm sure there will be. I'm sure there will be. I know I've got more questions as we get through on just how we're going to manage this, and as you and I have already discussed offline, the requirement for separate user IDs as well. So
yeah, absolutely. So that is quite a big challenge. I think for most organizations will have an issue with that. Just in terms of, this is a useful little table that ASME provides in terms of who's responsible for these various controls. And you can see you've got infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So there's different delivery models, and your provider is either more or less involved in the actual day-to-day management of your infrastructure. So this just gives you a bit of a feel for where Cyber Essentials see, or where ASME sees the responsibility lie in terms of making sure those 5 control areas are in place. So for example, for infrastructure as a service, so for example, you maybe have servers hosted in Amazon Web Services as EC2 servers. You're responsible for sorting out the firewalls, or the cloud provider provides the capability to do so. Again, secure configuration, that's your responsibility with support from the cloud provider, but I would say predominantly your responsibility. User access control, squarely your responsibility. Malware protection is a shared responsibility, and then security update management potentially a shared as well. Although in my view, I would probably put applicant for all of those around the IIS column. And then obviously as you move down the line, as you get less control over the infrastructure, you've got less control over how you can, whether you can actuate or actually use any of these controls. So for example, user access control makes sense because that's across the piece. You'll be responsible for user access control. If you've got a CRM system, that's software as a service, you're ultimately going to be managing your user access, or maybe a service provider, but on your behalf. So that's just a bit of an idea of where the responsibilities lie. And that will come out in the wash as you go through the questionnaire as well. But I guess the one thing that ASME also nailed us on in terms of the training is to say, whilst you can transfer a lot of the responsibility, that accountability still rests with yourself as the organization. So you have to pick cloud providers you can trust, and you have to still carry out due diligence to make sure those cloud providers actually can step up to their expectations of what their responsibility are to manage. So yeah, so I just wanted to highlight that ultimately, yes, you're using SaaS or PaaS because you're passing some of the management over to the service provider, whether that's Amazon or Google or maybe some of the smaller players. But you still the accountability still rests with yourself to pick secure providers. Okay, so next bunch of scope changes is previously the servers in scope were really only the internet facing ones. All servers are now actually in scope for Cyber Essentials. So all the patching rules apply to all servers, whether they're virtual or physical. It also applies to where you're virtualizing your hypervisors, so the sort of servers on which your virtual servers run, and also any virtual desktop servers as well. That's quite key as well. However, just an interesting little nuance, for Cyber Essentials Plus, we're still only testing servers that actually provide some sort of interactive desktop for users, so basically virtual desktops. We don't actually test the servers as in our sample, which is I found quite an interesting quirk, and probably something that some applicants could sort of potentially get a bit of a workaround there in terms of, yes, say they're patching every 14 days, but as we're not testing, you can probably, some applicants may sort of take a bit of a chance there to say, yeah, we are patching 14 days for our servers, but we're not going to test it for Cyber Essentials Plus, so maybe we'll do it every month, but we'll still say it's every 14 days. So obviously that's not truthful, but I can see that's potentially where some of the bits can slip through the net from a Cyber Essentials Plus perspective.
Maritz, this is potentially going to be a challenge, isn't it, for those organisations which have got possibly an old, I don't know, an old telephony device that's we've managed to put that's now absolutely in scope, whereas perhaps it's down level on software because you can't upgrade it, etc. That comes firmly now into scope.
Yeah, that's where the subsets come out. We'll talk about the subsets in a minute, because you can actually still farm that out of the network somehow. I might as well mention it now. So that's a good example of where you would do, you're not going to assess the whole company, you'll assess the company minus the telephony stuff. But that telephony server, for example, will need to be behind a firewall and a VLAN. You're not allowed to just, in the past, you could just stop that device from accessing the internet via a firewall rule. Now it actually has to be on a separate VLAN. Which is going to be an issue for telephony, for example, because telephony doesn't always play well with firewalls, especially if it's voice over IP. So this might actually be quite a limiting factor for clients who've got older kit, but that's sort of part of the infrastructure rather than just an old server with old software running on it.
So again, another good example about making sure that you get the scope absolutely nailed down when we start doing solutions.
Yeah. And making sure where you understand where if there are internal boundaries, whether they're good enough. Okay, another key part that they've beefed up a bit is remote working. So end user devices now explicitly includes bring your own devices as well. So if you allow your staff to use their mobile phones to access your email, for example, or their own laptops or their own tablets, then that is very much in scope for Cyber Essentials. However, the way it's in scope is obviously where we won't include those in testing. The strongest control that they can come up with is that you just have a really good BYOD policy to make sure that staff manage their personal devices in line with the Cyber Essentials requirements. So patching, access control, all that sort of other stuff. So there's no other technical control specifically mandated for BYOD, but it's worth knowing that it is definitely in scope for Cyber Essentials. So there are questions there in terms of how do you make sure that they manage their devices appropriately.
And certainly one of the things on that point, and we've been recommending to clients, they do this anyway, pre this set of questions from Cyber Essentials, is if you have subcontractors working within your organisation, they are using their own devices, then we always say that make sure as part of the contract that you have with those subcos that they have to conform to CE requirements.
Absolutely. Because essentially for that period of time, they become your devices or devices that connect to your organisational services and data. They clarified that home routers are out of scope. You can't touch home routers because it's a personal device. There's actually a data protection regulation that stops us from scanning home routers. However, as a company, if you provide home routers for your staff, then those devices are in scope because you manage that. So that's actually then a company device. But predominantly, the reliance for home workers is going to be on the software firewall on the endpoint. So making sure that you've got your Windows Defender firewall switched on, or Sophos, or whatever protection you have. And then also another way to sort of get away from the home boundaries by use of VPN. So if you do use a VPN connection back to the office, then essentially you're just extending the corporate network into your home environment. But essentially you're taking all of the sort of network components in between out of scope completely, because it's essentially a point-to-point connection to your corporate network. So that's remote working. Any questions or thoughts on that?
No questions or thoughts. And again, just one other piece of best practice that we do with clients is certainly where you've got some sort of acceptable use policy, for example, an InfoSec policy, is we encourage you to provide advice and guidance to employees on how to make their home network secure. So changing admin passwords, etc. And there's lots of information on the NCSC website on, and actually I think there's lots of guidance that you can direct employees to do those changes, which obviously makes them more secure as well in their home environment.
So we talked about the subset. So if you do segregate your network and only then assess part of it, then there needs to be a very clear boundary between what you are and aren't assessing. Obviously, an air gap is a good boundary, but if it's on the same network, then it needs to be explicitly on a separate VLAN that's actually behind a firewall as well. So you can very granularly prevent any sort of inbound or outbound communication with that device from the local network, not from the internet. From the internet as well, but yeah. So we'll be quite strict on that now, and that's again why the scoping is going to be quite important. I think what we'll probably do is, for the first few clients that most of our partners do, we'll probably provide some assistance during the scoping process, just to make sure that the revised scope is accurate and in line with what IASB expects it to be.
So Maritz, we just had a question come in as well. Does the VPN move the boundary to the corporate firewall if it dual routes, i.e. the internet traffic goes out the local home router?
I think that's a slightly different arrangement. I mean, ultimately the traffic that goes out your home router will be over your software firewall, and that device wouldn't accept any connections. It's more about protecting the device from inbound malicious activity in this case, rather than outbound, because we don't have any rules around website filtering or any of that sort of stuff as part of Cyber Essentials, not explicitly. So I would say, and it's interesting because actually that's probably the way most VPNs are configured these days, to allow all the Office 365 and Teams stuff to go over the internet and not clog up the corporate router. I think you probably got a bit of a mixed bag there, to be fair. I can't give you a straight answer. I think in practice it doesn't matter because the routers are out of scope anyway. So yeah, I think that answers the question.
And David, what you and I can do is we can catch up with Maritz offline if that would make it easier to go through the question.
Yeah, for sure.
Just a quick reminder for those of you that are unsure of how to submit a question, in the GoToWebinar control panel, you should be able to see a box that says question. If you do pull down there, you'll be able to submit your question. If you're struggling, then I'm actually available on Teams at the moment if you want to ping them through, and I'll ping those across to Maritz as we continue to go through the session.
Cool. So digging into some of the requirements that are a bit different then. So there are some more requirements around brute force attacks. So there are some requirements around making sure that you got account lockout set up on all of your systems. And if you cannot, MFA applied. So if you, but if you can't use MFA, then either you need to deny list of common passwords. So for example, on AD, I think you can set up a list of common passwords that you can't use, so literally simple passwords, or it needs to be a 12-character password. So this last bit is going to be interesting because where you've got the cloud service that doesn't provide MFA, essentially, and doesn't provide some sort of deny list of common passwords, which commonly doesn't, this might bring in some more burden on the user to remember longer passwords, and maybe then drive them towards using password managers, or even written down passwords for that matter. So it's just something to consider. Yeah, well, it's interesting because when you look at a lot of the guidance, some of these organizations or some of the that are issued, I have seen them saying it's better to use a physical book with passwords in than using simple passwords. I can sort of understand that. I mean, I still feel quite uncomfortable with that, but it's still better than using password 123, right?
And Maritz, I do some work as well alongside Warwickshire Police on the prevent side, and certainly their view is if you've written your passwords down, it's in a book, you've locked it in a cupboard at home, you're going to know when your house has been burgled.
Exactly.
And their view is very much that's a better strategy than, as you say, having password 123 football or whatever else, or the dog's name.
Or have the same password for every service.
Yep. Absolutely.
Even if it's complex. Even if it's complex. Okay.
This next point, is going to cause. No, this next point is going to cause some challenges, isn't it?
Yeah. So they want complete separation between end user and administrative activities from an account perspective. So we already do that for Windows by not giving people local admin or domain admin access on their normal accounts. Those of you who sort of look after the IT side, you know that actually it's quite common for staff now to have a normal user account and an admin account or a raft of admin accounts, but they're extending that into the cloud side as well. So wherever you have got that ability to have elevated privileges where you can then either reconfigure the platform or change user access, they want that to be done under a different user account.
So you and I have spoken about this a couple of times because, I'm a small business owner. We use lots of software as a service type cloud platforms. And I've just gone through and realized that because, as an admin, I can set up user IDs, I can amend privileges. I'm now seeing a whole series of platforms I'm going to need to have to buy a new license on and have them at software as a service provider so that I can manage. Yeah.
Exactly that. I mean, it's easy on a platform like Office 365 because I don't think you pay for admin users. You only pay for those users that is covered under the license, I think. But again, it just adds more complexity to setting it all up. I think once it's all set up, that's fine. But again, as I said, might have some extra costs involved in terms of setting up separate accounts for admins if they're also users of the system.
And I think one of the other things it's also highlighted is the need to make sure that you understand all the software as a service platforms you've got within your organisation, and most importantly, and this is perhaps a 27001 or an IASME governance requirement, is just understand that starters, movers, and leavers process.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, that is. I think that is part of the CE-bit as well. Anyway, the fact that you need to remove accounts.
You do. Yes. Certainly removing accounts, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, but again, it's also about understanding the capabilities of the cloud services that you use to see how can you actually secure that in the best possible way.
We've had a question coming from Andrew. What's the advantage of moving to Microsoft Azure for a small business of self-employed consultants using home routers working from home?
Well, I guess you don't have any on-premise stuff to worry about. That's a benefit. And also you've got centralized management through probably, I was going to say Intune or whatever they call it now. I think it's Microsoft Windows Update now. They keep on changing the name. So I think the benefit there is you're just completely premises agnostic. But the main thing for you guys would be to make sure that Azure is then properly secured using MFA. Obviously, Office 365 will sort of link in with that because the access will be maintained, and then it's about how you manage access to your laptops as end users. Whether you use Azure for your login as well to the Windows machines. So I think there's definitely benefits because it's less kit. You've got no physical kit you have to worry about, or no physical on-site AD services. So it just decomplexifies things a bit. Not a word, but anyway.
That's a great word, decomplexifies. Great, that. Word of the week.
Hopefully that answers Andrew's question.
And again, Andrew, if you require more information, then let's come back online afterwards and we can catch up with Maritz.
Cool.
Okay.
Then there's a couple of updates around password-based authentication. Just sort of brings it in line with the current guidance from the NCSC as well. Obviously links in with the MFA bit as well. Device locking is now a requirement. So having devices lock after a certain period of time. It's quite an old one, but they brought it back in now. And then the unlocking bit is the interesting bit because so obviously you can lock a device by a PIN number, biometric, or password. And this is probably more related to mobile devices as well. So if the credentials are solely used, then it needs to be a minimum password or PIN length of 6 characters. And also where that credential is potentially used elsewhere, then you need to apply the full password requirements. However, I think if you use a biometric and a PIN, then you should be okay with just using the 4-digit PIN code along with it instead of the biometric. With the biometric, if you need both. Okay. Again, some of these requirements we're still getting our head around in terms of what that looks like in practice. So I think we're all on a bit of a journey here, and it's interesting because IASME is saying the same thing, because they sort of the National Cybersecurity Centre sets the requirements. IASME sets the questionnaire, which is then approved by the NCSC, and then it's all about what it looks like in practice when you implement these. So I think IASME's got quite a way to go as well in terms of understanding the implications of some of these. So
the first few certifications we go through, Maritz, I guess we're all going to be feeling our way with this, aren't we?
Absolutely, yeah, I would say. So if you're unlucky enough to be a February or March baby,
yeah,
it's going to be a long road.
Yeah, we've got 2 or 3 clients on this call who are those February and March clients, yes.
Yeah. So I think all I would ask is bear with us a little bit on this one, because we are trying to get it done to the best of our capabilities and understanding the requirements. But yeah, hopefully we can sort of work together to make that work well. Okay. So security updates, again, that's probably something that you're not unfamiliar with. They've tweaked a little bit around some of the update rules, but I guess the main one is that if you've got devices that are unsupported, either they obviously need to remove them from your environment, or you can remove them from the scope by using a defined subset that prevents all traffic to and from the internet. So I think we talked about that again, but that's important in the context of security updates, especially in the context of the system that Ellen, you mentioned a bit earlier on the telephony side. But it has to follow that subset criteria. Okay. Also, another bit around patching is in the past, when we did our Cyber Essentials Plus test, we could actually review and revise the CVSS code. So if we see a vulnerability that's really, really difficult to exploit in the context of how it's implemented within the client, we had the leeway to say, well, actually, I think it's okay because because it's difficult to exploit. They've taken that away from us now. So if that's a high or critical vulnerability, then that is still a high and critical vulnerability. We can't sort of say, actually, no, it's not really one anymore. So we have to go by what the scanning tool tells us.
And this is one of the areas where we know that clients typically, especially if they've got large tenancies, this is an area where typically we see problems where you have to cut that asset inventory and the software inventory almost as you're submitting the question set. We know from experience that there's no point doing it even a week before, because there's a possibility of a device not having a patch installed, or all sorts of different problems. So I know that's where we've had some challenges. We've
had the issue where an assessment takes a little while, but then you actually cross over the support deadline for a certain version of Windows without us knowing it. And then when we get moderated, they look at what was actually valid on the day of assessment, although we might have done the assessment 2 weeks, 3 weeks before. So we're going to have to do our testing and the deployment or the issuing of the certificates pretty much as close together as possible, just to avoid us falling into any of those traps again. Interestingly, this is not actually in the questionnaire, and I looked for it, but in the requirements document, they've actually added guidance for backups now in Cyber Essentials. So whilst it's not a requirement currently, and I expect this to become a requirement in the years to come, they've just aligned that with a lot of the other guidance issued by NCSC, which almost always has a backup element to it, as obviously as your sort of last resort to recover from a cyber incident. So I just thought it's worth highlighting that as well.
Maritz, just going back to the previous question, sorry, I picked up a question, and what we'll do as we get to the end of the slide set is we'll unmute everybody, so if they want to raise questions. I've just got another question coming from David as well, regarding patching of software and supported and unsupported. How does unsupported apply to open source software?
I really like David. Very good question. It's difficult to say when open source software become unsupported, because obviously there's nobody announcing an end of life date. I think with open source, it's probably more about whether that component or that application you're using have got any security vulnerabilities. And obviously, if it has, and nobody is issuing any updates or rolling out any updates, you could argue that platform is no longer supported. It is a lot harder for open source, and I think that's probably going to be on a case-by-case basis. The way we'll do it for Cyber Essentials Plus is if we do a scan of a device and the scanner tells us there's software that's vulnerable, that will be our indicator, really, rather than just pure version numbers. So I don't know if that, hopefully that sort of answers your question. A difficult question and a difficult answer, I think. Again, we can pick up afterwards if you want to discuss it in more detail. Cool. So there's a couple of grace periods. We talked about the MFA one already. Those of you who use thin clients, actually that's something I didn't highlight a bit earlier. They actually want thin clients to be thin clients previously have been broadly out of scope. So this is if you use a CSRisk, one of these little terminal computers with a screen and a keyboard, which then actually connects to something like a CSRisk environment, which then gives a user a virtual desktop. Those are actually in scope for Cyber Essentials, but it's not been that explicit. So they are going to be included in January 2023. And you need to make sure those thin clients are also supported and receive security updates. So that includes the hardware, the firmware that's running on the thin clients, but also the additional Windows that you maybe run on top of your CSRisk environment. All of those bits and pieces all need to be up to date. Yeah. And I think the last one is a bit obvious, but yeah. Just a quick one on charges. So these are the ASME prices that they've agreed with the NCSC. So the 300 price mark, which is the current price mark, is going to be only for micro employees, micro companies, so 0 to 9 employees. Then small will be 400, which is 10 to 49 employees. Medium, which is 50 to 249, will be £450, and then large, it will be 500. So not a massive price increase. Hopefully larger organizations won't really make much difference because that's your annual fee. But that's sort of the price range. And the ASME governance one has been increased as well, in line with the listing there.
And Maritz, I'm right in saying, aren't I, that Sutcliffe Insurance are still going to be brokers for the free insurance as well for those organisations with a turnover of less than 20 million, yeah. I think, isn't it?
So none of that, as far as I'm aware, have changed.
So
that should all be the same. It's an interesting one. You should mention insurers, because we're seeing more and more insurers are asking some really tricky cybersecurity questions before they're actually giving you cyber insurance.
Yeah, some of you may be on a call. Some of you may be on a call with me last week when I was actually working with the International Institute of Risk and Safety Managers, NQA, and then Ian McKinney from Gallagher Insurance, and that he was very much saying that organisations really need to embrace schemes such as Cyber Essentials, because without them you are going to really struggle to get certainly cyber insurance and potentially other insurances as well. Yeah.
Or worse, you'll get cyber insurance, but when it comes to actually them paying out, they'll look at your controls that were in place during the breach and realize that you were potentially negligent, and therefore that'll prevent them from paying out. So you'll be paying for insurance, but you won't get the benefits.
Well, certainly there's been a contraction of the insurance market in the cyberspace, and I would encourage everyone to read the small print of their policies as well. It's not necessarily covered now under what you might have thought would have been covered under your PI policy.
certainly ransom payments won't be. Not many companies in the UK cover ransom payments for ransomware. Cool. So just lastly, just a very quick run through of Cyber Essentials Plus. Those of you who are going for Cyber Essentials Plus, just to make you aware of what the process is we will have to go through. So the first 5 tests are broadly the same as what it was. So for test 1, we need to do that external assessment of internet-facing services. So that'll be our sort of vulnerability scan. However, there's more work to be done now in terms of if you've got any services that require a user to authenticate to it. So for example, if you've got a website with a user login, if you've got a VPN connection service, we actually have to test that that meets the user requirement, the user authentication requirements of the Cyber Essentials scheme. So for example, does it require complex passwords? What happens if you type in your password 10 times wrong? Does it actually lock you out? That sort of thing. So that's where some of the extra time comes in terms of the work we'll have to do, depending on the complexity of your environment as well. So test 2, which is the patching. So that's the bit where we do the internal scans of your environment. But also we need to do a manual inspection of a sample of mobile devices as well, where we can't do automated scans. So the way we tend to do that is if we're lucky enough that you're using mobile device management, we can use a mobile device management report. Otherwise, this may have to be a question of, if we do it remotely, somebody holding up their mobile phone to the camera and then going to certain parts of the config of the device just to show us that that those devices are up to date. For example, running the latest version of Android, or latest supported version of Android, latest supported version of iOS, and so on and so forth. Then we've got test 3, which is the checking that malware protection is turned on, or that you're actually following those controls. So again, as part of our checks, we never really tended to do this in too much detail, because we can pick some of this up as part of the internal scan. But in some cases, we may have to manually look at end users' computers to sort of say, show me where Sophos is running, show me the version that's running, show me that it's up to date. Then we've got the 2 tests, the test malware being delivered by email, malware delivered via a website. So this is, again, those of you familiar with the testing, this is where we send a raft of pretend malware or sample malware, and we see how the email system responds. So we see how the end user desktop device responds. And the same with downloads via website. We've got a set of sample files that you can download from the internet, and we examine whether the end user device stops the user from arbitrarily running stuff. And the 2 extra tests we have to do is we have to validate the implementation of multi-factor authentication on cloud services. This is going to be a pain to do, I think, because essentially we have to go through each and every one of your cloud services and check that you've got MFA enabled. So we'll have to log in, for example, on an in-private session, go to the site, try and log in as a person, and make sure that you get the multi-factor challenge. There's not going to be so much of an issue this year because it's only admin accounts that need MFA. Next year, we'll have to verify normal users as well. So I'm not looking forward to that, but because that could potentially be quite a painful test to do. And then lastly, we need to validate that administrative and normal user account separation is actually in place. So for this, we'll ask a user to run, for example, run the command prompt using administrator access, and then we want to see it actually prompting for a different user account. If it's just the UAC that comes up on Windows, for example, that won't be good enough. It needs to actually prompt for a separate account. Otherwise, it means that that normal user has got admin access as well. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour for Cyber Essentials Plus as well. I don't know if there's any questions.
We do, and
excellent.
We do, and what we could do as well, Maritz, if anybody wants to raise a question, actually we'll unmute them if they have a more detailed question to ask. Then I think you've got the ability to raise your hand in the GoToWebinar control panel. But Richard's asked a question as well, which is, are there any additional requirements around removable storage devices? We thought they were going to tighten up on this.
It's interesting, that's one of the areas they didn't tackle. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. But no, there's no new requirements around removable media at all. Actually, if you look at the scope, removable media is outside of the scope.
Which is a surprise, isn't it? Real surprise.
Yeah,
I
because
thought they'd have wanted
interesting
passwords
because,
or encryption or something.
yeah, the other day I saw somebody posting to say that they've got a USB stick through the post, and it was malware, and there are still people using removable storage as a vector, definitely. And actually, it's all these other goodies, right? Because you can actually, I think with people working from home now, if you if you send stuff to their office address, it'll automatically maybe be resent to their home by the office email, by the office mail system. So you can literally just target loads of users, and it'll actually come to their home addresses now. So it's quite a clever way of doing it. It's not the cheapest way because memory sticks cost money, but it's quite effective.
We're doing an education training session for a client in a couple of months' time, and we've been specifically asked that if you want to give freebies away, freebies will not be accepted if they're on, as you say, memory sticks, USB devices.
Yeah, big risk.
Yeah,
so,
big risk.
But no, it's a very good point, actually. Maybe could be that it's a bit of an oversight. They were really focusing on adding the cloud stuff because that's where the biggest risk is seen. But yeah. I mean, the requirement for auto run is still there, by the way. So making sure that auto run isn't enabled or that's disabled. So, but that's really the only removable media control in there.
A question from Dean for a change. Dean's asked, going back to enabling MFA for cloud services, what are your thoughts on the timeline given for enabling MFA for users? And Dean goes on to say he feels a deadline for conformity should have been shorter, maybe 3 months, given that users will generally be the weakest link in the system and often a valuable attack vector for malicious entities.
Well, interestingly, IASME said that the date they've given isn't a target date. It's just the date at which they're going to start marking those as fail. That shouldn't stop companies from implementing MFA as soon as they can. So don't see that deadline as your target. That's just purely at the point where IASME has said, we will now take this seriously, guys. If you don't have it, you'll fail. So that's why they had to give people enough time for the whole industry, for the whole everybody's IT systems to sort of get up to speed. And I think if they put a 3-month limit in there, people would just go stuff this. We're not going to do Cyber Essentials. So they had to balance there as well.
Yeah, I know that you and I have just had a discussion as well that one of the things the NCSC do not want to see is the number of CE certifications to go down in the UK, isn't it? This isn't about knocking people out of the park. This is about helping them to do the right thing. Yeah.
And unfortunately, the environment, the threat is such that you have to start putting some of these controls in place because otherwise you're just going to get run over. And I think the MFA one is a good example of that, where, as you say, they're giving people a bit of leeway, but it's actually quite daft not to put MFA on Office 365 and Google for the end users. It's a bit of a no-brainer because if you look at all the business email compromises we've seen in the last 2 years, it's all because people don't use MFA. Pretty much 99.9% of it, because people give their username and password away.
Yes, and I know none of our clients will do that. So, but I appreciate, we've got involved in other systems that you talk about MFA. And again, if you're a small user, we've worked with a couple of sole traders over the last couple of years. This is not necessarily their kind of habitat in which they're comfortable.
No,
we've got a question from. It is, yeah. We've got a question from Andrew coming in. Maniba, I think you're going to unmute Andrew so that he can ask his question.
Oh, hi there.
Hey,
the security updates, how do we make you say you can often find yourself out of, by the time you've assessed a security update, it's actually, as a small business, knowing what the latest security update is. If you say believe 15.1, that's fine. But it's how do you keep on top of what the essential ones are, when you're at some distance and you're an IT consultant?
Yeah, I can imagine it's pretty hard. I mean, the main bit actually that they're aiming on Cyber Essentials now is making sure that you've got auto updates enabled on everything that supports auto updates, because that will definitely help. So that includes Windows, it includes your applications like Adobe, your Chrome, your Firefox, and so on. So that should cover off the majority of applications. And actually for the basic self-assessment, because there's no audit, you can only do that much to ensure it. I think it's just if you are going to Cyber Essentials Plus, you will need to up your game a little bit in terms of checking that everything's up to date before the assessment.
Well, yeah, we do the basic, and basically we get everybody to show us what they've got.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the easiest way to do it, and maybe just have a monthly or a quarterly process whereby you just ask people to tell you what they've got and make sure they've done the updates. It is very difficult for smaller businesses if you don't want to spend money on tools to support it as well, third-party tools. That said, I think Windows Update, or as it was in June, if you do have the license that allows you to get that level of capability on Office 365, it's got capabilities to maintain non-Windows applications as well. So you've got an element of being able to manage it centrally, but then you need an element of expertise into it to be able to set it up as well. And obviously you'll have an increased license cost for your E5 license, for example, you have to get for Microsoft 365 as well.
Because that would be very useful, sort of Harold and Maritz, as a small business, knowing you don't mind the incremental cost for something if you know what the extra benefits are, because obviously knowing that you pay the right kind of license and you tell all the consultants they're going to have to be on that, and it's that cost. But at the end of the day, it's only a couple of hundred quid amongst, when you're doing a turnover of $500,000.
I mean, actually, it is still quite cheap for what you get. And Microsoft's been quite clever because they've bundled all the really good security tools into the highest licensing, which I think is a bit cheeky because they should really provide that as a platform for everybody. But yeah, that's really where it's worth knowing somebody who knows their Office 365 reasonably well. To understand how to not just whether it's the right license fee, but also how do you implement that capability to the best of so that you get the most value out of it as well.
Okay.
Maritz, you and I have worked together now for what, 5 or 6 years? Sometimes it seems forever. We've been joined longer, exactly. We know that we can apply for Cyber Essentials through the IASME site, but I am going to give a quick plug for CSRisk and now who are part of More ClearCom. If you're not a Risk Evolves customer and you need support through Cyber Essentials, I would recommend applying for Cyber Essentials through the CSRisk, More ClearCom, or even through the Risk, or coming through us for Risk Evolves. That way, from an auditor perspective, we have the ability to pick up the phone and talk to Maritz and his team around CE submissions. I know that experience isn't always true of other certification bodies. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying that, but certainly we've got the relationship with Maritz and his guys. So that if we have any of these problems, if you have any how do I queries, we can quickly get on top of them and just talk about what the assessor is going to be looking for.
And also if you go directly to the IASME website, they do a round robin in terms of who does the assessment. So you're never quite sure who the assessment is going to go to, and it'll be a very hands-off process where they'll go through your assessment and fail you if you're wrong, where we try and be a little bit more consultative in our approach. We'd rather feedback and guide you along the right route rather than fail you. We're not in the business of failing people.
No. And then I'm going to put Maritz very much on the spot. So Risk Evolves has got a series of webinars that we will be hosting again on the 17th of March. And what we will do on the 17th of March, that's what, 2 months away, we'll go through and we'll give you an update on some of our experiences. We've got a number of clients who are going through Cyber Essentials over the next 6 to 8 weeks, and we'll give you some updates and feedback on how we found the new CE question set, some of our lessons learned. I'm very happy to share that with you, and hopefully I can persuade Maritz to come and join us on those sessions. So that's the 17th of March, and details will be on the Risk Evolves website as well. If we haven't got any more questions, what I'll do is I'll close the call. As I say, this is being recorded. And it will be a copy of which will be on the Risk Evolves website over the next couple of days. Other than that, just a really great thank you, Maritz. I've already had some feedback already from people who've had to drop off the call just to say brilliant update, lots for people to think about, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely day.